where media development in some ways found its origins in the days after the Cold War. For most of the period since those 25 years ago, that part of the world, especially in the period after the end of the war in former Yugoslavia, it was a region that showed enormous progress, and it got a significant amount of donor support for a period that helped it move in the direction of a more democratic, pluralistic, and peaceful part of the world. And there was a strong consensus among the populations of those countries about the ultimate goal of building that kind of democratic society and about joining the European Union and about building a pluralistic kind of system that was all bolstered by independent media. Today, this region is torn by many other cross currents and competing ideologies and the media development picture has changed quite dramatically. In the last 2 weeks, we have seen an about face in the country that in many ways was the most impressive reformer in the whole region, and that's Poland. The new Polish government just took control of the public service media in that country, dissolving the independent commission that had formerly run the broadcasting system there and put political figures in to run it. Virtually overnight, this country that had once been the shining star of Central Europe's media reforms has joined an earlier backslider, Hungary, and several other EU members whose commitment to independent media is in question. I actually think it's hard to exaggerate the enormous challenge and indeed the threat to the European Union that is posed by having two major Central European powers turning away from media freedom and the pillars of democracy, acting in concert inside the European Union, where they have veto power on any decision. In the last Freedom of the Press survey by Freedom House, 6 European members, no less, ranked in the partly free category. That's a total of 6 countries inside the EU that can block decisions and making it harder for the EU to act as a force against some of the things that are going on in its broader neighborhood. Poland at that time, by the way, was still listed as free. We'll see what happens now. When I was recently in Brussels, just before what happened in Poland took place, I talked to some EU officials who said that the backsliding among these countries inside the EU was creating one of the most difficult situations and daunting challenges to democracy and media freedoms that they've faced since the end of the Cold War. So today our goal is to look more deeply at what's going on inside the media systems of a group of countries in this European space, both inside and outside the EU, that once was so promising. When Leon Morse of IREX and I started talking about this event a few months ago, we thought it would be good to see if the Media Sustainability Index could provide insights into this environment and give us some indications about what kinds of responses are needed. Where does this deterioration start? How does it progress? What could be the responses from donors and media development professionals? That's our goal today, and to hear from this eminent panel of experts that we've assembled about how they see the situation and what our responses to it should be. Our panel today will be moderated by Susan King. Susan is the Dean of the School of Journalism and Mass Communications at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's the former Vice President for External Affairs for the Carnegie Corporation, and she spent 20 years in Washington, D.C. as a reporter covering politics. She's also a member of Seema's Advisory Council and the board of IREX, so she's the perfect impartial moderator. We are thrilled to have you with us, Susan, and I'll turn the discussion over to you. For those of you who are tweeting, please use the hashtag MediaDev. It's in your program. It'd be great to get some further exposure of this conversation, which is also being broadcast on the web. So I'll turn it over to Susan now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. I want to make sure the mic is okay, because I think that's working. We'll make sure, but if somebody will signal me if there are any issues with the microphone. I'm very excited to be here. I've been a member of Seema since Marguerite Sullivan sort of inaugurated it, and so and I haven't been here recently. And I feel right at home because everyone's sitting in the back of the classroom, so nothing is different. One just slight change, because I think it's relevant to our discussion. I'm now the dean of the School of Media and Journalism. We, as a faculty, spent a year discussing, the changes going on. After all, we're preparing students for a world we don't know, and they've got to invent it. So we haven't changed our roots, the journalism values and the commitment to public discussion in communities and that journalism matters, but we are part of the media ecosystem. So I think it's relevant in that. I'm excited to be here and to just lead the discussion. I want to put it in one piece of context, and that is that it's now 25 years ago, and so some of you were not born. A few of you at least will remember, like me. This city was electrified at the end of the 80s with the end of the Iron Curtain and the amazing world changes that were going on, and no more so than journalists who felt that journalism was a critical player in the new world of, we hoped would be democracy. And there was hardly a journalist worth their salt that didn't get on a plane and go to the area we're going to talk about. Budapest, Prague. I started an organization with Judy Woodruff that the group of women in Washington started called the International Women's Media Foundation. We were not going to only bring free press, we were going to liberate women. We went to all these cities to bring answers like, what is the business model for the future? What does it mean to be an independent press? So what's happened now, 25 years later? That's part of what we're going to discuss, but I just wanted to put it on the context of enthusiasm and excitement. Oh, it's not on. That will make a difference. See, I used to know how to do this when I was a broadcast journalist. Yeah, you could turn them on. So we're going to start with, I think, something that's very important, close to my heart. I am on the IREX board, and when I was at Carnegie Corporation, we funded IREX for many years. That's why I knew its reputation. IREX came into this space at this moment of opportunity, and they've always been involved in independent media. And this index is one of the most interesting and unique sort of measurements of where is an independent media, and they've had to define what that is, and they had to find ways to measure it. So I'm calling you the chart man, because he is bringing to us not anecdotes or not ideas about where things are, but bringing us what they've been able to figure out, and by having a number of metrics that would put together where is the health and the sustainability of media today in a couple of the countries. So Leon, why don't you take it away, Mr. Chartman, master's degree in international development, a political scientist. No one could be more perfect for putting data together for free press. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Susan, and thank you to Seema for hosting this event today, and thank you to all of you for coming out this cold morning. As Mark mentioned, we were discussing over the summer an event. It started off because there has been a lot of sort of bad news about the media in the region. I said, well, there's a couple of countries where the news isn't so bad. But then the conversation quickly turned to, well, if there is some good news and there's a lot of bad news, how can we keep the good news from becoming the bad news of the future? So I wanted to kind of frame the discussion that we'll be having later in terms of using the Media Sustainability Index to really identify where some of this backsliding really occurred. I'll talk briefly about what the Media Sustainability Index is, and then move on. And other questions you have, you can find me afterwards, or you can find on our website more information. But the Media Sustainability Index, IREX created this in 2000. We launched it in 2001 in 20 countries in Europe and Eurasia, and we've been using it on an annual basis ever since. Now, when we created the Media Sustainability Index, certainly we knew about the Freedom House study, and Freedom House is an important freedom advocacy organization, but IREX is a media development organization, took a little bit of a different approach. And so we measure different, what we call objectives, 5 different angles that create sort of the holistic picture of the media. We have free speech, professional journalism, the plurality of news, so the different voices that appear in the media, business management, and finally supporting institutions, and those are both academic, in-service training, and also professional associations. We, with the help of about a dozen media experts in each of the countries, there's a panel discussion with a questionnaire that we've developed. And in addition to providing comments and about 12 pages of text to describe the situation each year, there's also a set of scores. I'll be referring to those scores, so I thought I would just tell you briefly what those scores mean. I won't go through all of this, but you can see it's a 5-point scale from 0 to 4. 0 is essentially saying no, the country does not meet the aspects of the indicator. With 4 being yes, it meets all the aspects of this indicator, and importantly has remained intact over multiple changes in government, et cetera. So the point is, it's really getting at not just a brief situation where things look great. It's really not only does it look great, but it's been great for a while, and it shows promise of resilience. So between 2001 and about the 2006-07 study, several of the countries in Southeast Europe that had been receiving significant assistance had made great strides. And I picked out 4 of them. I picked out Bosnia, Bulgaria, Macedonia, and Serbia. And all 4 of these countries had received significant international funder assistance, including USAID funding. There were significant projects, particularly in Bosnia and Serbia, and important projects as well in Macedonia and Bulgaria. And so as you can see, so I included the baseline and then skipped up to the 06-07. So if you look at the baseline, there was increasing progress to the point where Bulgaria, for example, and Bosnia had both been teetering right on the edge of what we call near sustainability. They were in the very upper reaches of near sustainability, scoring just below 3. So again, 4 is a perfect score. 3 is quite good. With Macedonia and Serbia pretty solidly in the middle of what we call near sustainability. But as you can see, over time, all the way up to last year's study, 2015, all 4 of these countries have slipped into what we call unsustainable mixed system, with Bosnia just over that threshold. And actually, it looks to be, I'm preparing right now the 2016 study. I'm just getting in early results. And it's looking, for example, that Bosnia is going to continue its downward trend. But what happened? Why 2008? Why did this start at that point? So I broke down all the objective scores and looked at the percent change in score since the 2006-07 study. The 4 countries by their 5 objectives. And what stood out to me, I mean, it's all negative. So at first glance, you see just a lot of negative numbers. But what really stood out to me was just how much the business management objective fell in all 4 countries. It fell the most by percent in all 4 countries. And it's pretty significant, for example, when you compare Bulgaria or Bosnia or Serbia in particular, you look and you think, well, maybe it was just a freedom of speech issue or legal backsliding, but that's not really what the panelists are saying in terms of their numerical scores. I mean, certainly it's negative, but not so significantly when you compare, Serbia minus 8% versus minus 48%, or minus 14% in Bulgaria compared with minus 57%. So in the space of about 7 years, there's been significant weakening of the media sector, led by the business management side of things. But what happened? I mean, what is behind all of that? Certainly there's the world financial crisis that began in 2008 and intensified thereafter. There was also a sea change in the way media operate, particularly the advertising sector. Online advertising, very cheap to produce and deploy, undermined the advertising market. And then finally, there were political forces at work that identified these media and try to capture and essentially try to capture them using their weaknesses, using the weak advertising market, their their lower revenues to sort of pull them into their political orbit. I pulled out some quotes just from a couple of chapters. This is one of the strengths of the Media Sustainability Index. Again, I mentioned that we have about 12 pages of text. So across our 40 indicators, there's at least a paragraph on each describing what has happened in the past year and what the state of that indicator is. And so here you can see from 2011 in Bosnia and 2013 from Bulgaria, and showing how the business management objective score changed that year. You can see, for example, in Bosnia, revenue sources are drying up with a significant fall in revenue. You look at Bulgaria, and it's talking about the way that EU advertising funds are being captured only by the national media, or how local media are becoming increasingly reliant on local government sources of funding. So, I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg. If you go back to the chapters and you will find a lot more information, and I can talk about some of that later. But the reason why this is important, I think, is because there is this good news, and there's both cautious news and there's better news. So the cautious news is that despite tumult in Georgia and Ukraine over the years, so they had progressed from the baseline to 2006-07 pretty well, but then both fell and have made a recovery. Georgia's made a pretty dramatic recovery, but some events there over the past year have started to worry us in the media development field. Similarly, in Ukraine, things have picked up post-Maidan. So if that positive trend continues, how can we keep that positive trend positive? And then finally, I point to Kosovo, because Kosovo was one of the countries that also received a lot of assistance, but for some reason was more resilient to this downward trend over time. Except recently, that trend has caught up with it, and you can see from a high point of 2.6 in, I think that's 2010, it's been on a negative trend since, and everything I've heard coming out of there is that things are worrying journalists. And then finally, I just wanted to close with the good news I talked about earlier. Armenia and Moldova, you can see the baseline, not very impressive scores. In fact, they both declined slightly up to 2006-07, but then have been finishing much stronger lately. Although Armenia, I think maybe this year will finish about the same, or we'll see. I know there's been some events there that have worried people. So I'd like to now start the discussion.
One quick question, just to clarify: the good news, the going up, would that also be because the media management piece was stronger, or was there a consistent thread of why it was going up?
You know, it isn't so much due to business management. I printed out all the numbers so that I can refer to them. But if you look at Armenia, it's actually the associations, the supporting institutions that have wildly improved. I mean, that has more than doubled since 2006-07. In Moldova, it's been actually the quality of journalism.
Okay, good. I was hoping for that answer, but I didn't know, because it's a perfect segue to our next speaker, because we'll go into more of the media management later. But this is like a reunion for us, because I was a funder of ICJF, and Vjollca is one of the best in the media training world, the whole development world. She is Albanian, so she lived in those dark ages, studied in China, so she's really global. I mean, she at Beijing University, you can't get more global than that to have your degree from there. She said she studied Albanian and Chinese, and wait till you hear English. But is done training in Eastern Europe, so and that was her area of responsibility. So she knows this area for a long time, and is currently head of their communications and fundraising. So she also knows the foundational kind of investments. But what I had wanted to ask you to start off anyway, and it fits into that perfectly, is ICJF has been investing in journalists for many time, and really the quality of journalism, the training of journalists, trying to build a cadre of people that no matter where the political world may go, they knew the kind of essence of what it meant to serve a public. So in this kind of tumult, is that enough? Do they survive? Do they push aside? What's happening from your perspective? And you need my mic.
Oh, yes. I forgot about this. Well, it's very interesting when you started. I just wanted to segue on when you started with, when in the 80s and early 90s, when things changed in Eastern Europe. And I was on that end of the picture when you were coming in and trying to help. And it was such an encouragement, and it was so energizing for all of us who grew up in closed societies to see that there are people who cared, who wanted to help us. And the state of journalism in Eastern Europe at that time was pretty dire. Journalists were, the few journalists that were there, they did not know what independence was. And it did make a difference, all that assistance that poured in those years. People like you and others who came and talked to us made a huge, huge difference, not only in creating a new course of journalists there, but also in building helping build sustainability for media. And these journalists that were trained and came out of that time are still there. They are in existence and they are still doing amazing work. Many organizations, the US government, European Union, foundations like Open Society did major work in Eastern Europe to help build this core of journalism. And interestingly enough, many of those that are still working today and being very successful are focusing their works in investigative journalism. They are now leading some highly successful organizations like OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, that is successfully functioning all over Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. They've done amazing stories over the past few years, as many of you have known. They broke the Magnitsky scandal, which led to barring several Russian officials from traveling to the US, which led to freezing of luxury high-rise apartments in Manhattan bought by criminal money. They broke several major scandals involving Scandinavian TV and telecom companies. The arrest of 26 people due to the horse meat story that OCCRP broke together with The Guardian. These are journalists that our organizations trained at that time. IREX, Internews, BBC, Media Action, a lot of independent foundations were there in full force. Paul Radu is one example that I love to quote. He's now executive VP, a multiple award-winning, courageous journalist. He's done amazing work. We started working with Paul, and Sherry is here, Sherry Riccardi, who is a trainer in our program, a human trafficking cross-border program in Eastern Europe. Paul stood out from a lot of the journalists participating in it. He ended up leading this cross-border network that we helped establish in the region. He trained the journalists there how to follow the money, how to run investigations, how to work together in conditions when the internet was barely there. I'm talking 2000, 2001. There was no Wi-Fi anywhere in that region. He taught them how to use databases to find information. He ended up establishing this amazing investigative dashboard that is now in use all over the world, and it's in multiple languages, and it's a free resource for investigative journalists to go in and find information on companies, on connections that they need for traffickers, organized crime, you name it. This is just one example. There's also another one who I know many of you are familiar with, Hatija Ismailova from Azerbaijan. She was another participant in our programs in the late 90s, early 2000s for investigative journalism. A journalist who unfortunately and very sadly, as you know, ended up in prison last year in her home country in Azerbaijan for exposing corruption and abuse that was not music to the ears of the government. And there are so many other stories like these of journalists who continue to work in those countries and continue to do outstanding work. Unfortunately, as Leon said, the same cannot be said of many of the media companies that became sustainable, many of those that managed to break away from government control after the fall of the Iron Curtain and gather these journalists together to do quality reporting have slid back into the hands of politicians, business interest groups, or special interest groups for all the reasons that Leon mentioned about a poor economy, a weakened economy that decimated the media's ability to sustain on advertising. That's non-existent anymore. Many depend on government advertising, and you know what that means. There's a tendency also of governments, and very worrisome among EU countries like Poland and Hungary, as we mentioned, to control the media. And there's nothing the US government or the US can do because it cannot go in and it cannot provide assistance to EU countries. So that's a paralysis there. So the picture is pretty grim if you look at it from this angle of the media companies in general. And the question I hope we'll discuss here today is whether there is a renewal of international support. Will this be another temporary lifeline? What happens when this stops? Do the media slide back again? I know this backsliding was a combination of different factors, including the global economic crisis, but there's a lot of political developments happening in this area that has led to this backsliding as well. The very small successful organizations that I mentioned, a number of successful organizations like OCCRP, BIRN, which is the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, and its online publication, Balkan Insight, continue to do outstanding work, but the reason they do so is because of international support. They're not really self-sustainable. They are constantly harangued by corrupt officials, by the media who are dependent on these officials, or by organized crime, but they continue their work undaunted simply because of this backing, international backing. The journalists who work for these organizations, who are local journalists, are often under immense pressure, and they often cannot really continue to do their work unless if they didn't of this international support. We know of the example of Hatija, who is now in prison, unfortunately. The video that was circulated against an intrepid woman journalist in Montenegro going on. She couldn't continue to do the great work she's doing unless she had the support from outside. So another factor in this is that while most of this quality reporting in the region is found online, it's not in the print, it's not on TV sites, social media, can easily, disappear under that weight. There are lots of websites completely untransparent as regards ownership that put up any information daily. No fact checking. They act like tabloids, and people read them and they believe them. In many countries, there's no transparency on online media ownership, so nobody knows who is behind these websites that claim to be news portals. The rise of social media too has led to an influx of voices. I know in Albania or in other neighboring countries in the Balkans, Facebook is highly popular. People believe what they read on Facebook, and that becomes the news of the day. You have the politicians who have their own social media lackeys, like they do everywhere. There's another force that is influencing truth from fiction. And this is one area that, again, I hope we'll discuss here today, is what can we do, or what the journalists there can do that are experienced to train citizens how to report the news or how to tackle those social issues responsibly, not based on what they see on Facebook by so-and-so. But while the situation is challenging and rather grim nowadays as regards the media organizations particularly, there are some things that have changed. And actually your index shows it very nicely how people have changed, the public has changed their perception about the media. Take an example of, a case I'm familiar with from Albania. One of the most popular TV stations there, so-called independent TV stations that came into existence in the 90s after the fall of the communist regime, was known for changing allegiances to each government that came in power just to get, business or political favors or advertising favors. Most recently, this November, the owner of this TV station allegedly got another favor from the current government in Albania. But this made headlines all over the country on both print and online media. There was major concern everywhere. The interesting thing that I noticed from this is this would have been a non-story a few years ago. It's one of so many scandals, one of so many favors that the media owners get from the government. No, this time there was concern. It was out there. People were talking about it, which shows that there is an increased awareness among the public of what the media, of media freedom and what the media can do. There's more and more people turning to the media when they observe injustices, which is another area that we could, build upon and capitalize on as we review on what we can do to support freedom of the media in those countries. That's all I had for now. Yeah.
That's a good, I think, a good platform to show sort of what's happened over this period of time. And there is optimism there that there are journalists who are deeply trained. I think when you think about weaknesses and vulnerabilities, however, it is true that if businesses are vulnerable, which is what your media index shows, it makes the whole institution vulnerable. And that's part of what we're talking about, why these pieces are interlocked. USAID has been there from the beginning as sort of a player in this field and an important player because it was the money and the engine behind much of what went on in these early days in the post-Soviet collapse. And has been where, and donors always sort of set some of the agendas because where you're putting your emphasis is where people will put their development work. You bring a great perspective. You're an alumna of Seema. You worked here, so welcome back. Now you are at USAID running and advising on media development in this part of the world, so you've got a really laser-like view of this region. What is the where is the moment right now? Is there any sense that we didn't sustain our attention long enough? We thought everything was fine before the economic collapse. Is there a sense we really need to get involved in it? Give us a sort of view of where it's gone from and where we are now. And Georgetown School of Foreign Services, she's got the creds.
Thank you, Susan. When I was asked to speak on this panel, I thought about how 10 years ago, none of us expected to be here talking about this. If we were going to be talking about lessons learned, I think we probably expected to be talking about how successful we were at applying lessons learned to other countries and other regions. And instead, unfortunately, we're talking about regression and deterioration and backsliding in the media environment. And it reminds me of a quote from the baseball legend who might be quoted too much in media development, I don't know, Yogi Berra. And he said, the future ain't what it used to be. And I think it's very applicable here. But when we look at lessons learned, it's very important to look at the key challenges. And I think Leon and Vjollca have outlined them well. Poorly functioning legal and regulatory frameworks, low media literacy, ineffective audience measurement, lack of transparency of ownership or concentration of ownership, political and financial capture of the media, just to name a few. So it's understanding these key challenges, it's drawing on our own experiences and getting input from our partners that really help us inform these lessons learned as we move forward. And I think sometimes I get frustrated with these conversations. Why do we keep having these conversations on lessons learned? Are these lessons repetitive? Are they obvious? And I would argue that it's important to continue having them because the environment, obviously, as we can see from Leon's presentation, is not static. And it's the way that we apply the lessons learned that's different. And it's also looking at lessons learned in a positive sense. So not just looking at what we did wrong, but looking at what we did, what went well, and learning just as much from that as what didn't go well. And so I'm going to talk about 5 lessons learned, and I'll be brief. Because having been on the other side of this, I know that Seema and Ned audiences are very interactive and not shy. So I know that you'll probably all have some suggestions as well. So the first lesson that I'll talk about is that it's not enough just to have laws in place. That's just part of the equation. For example, they need to be adhered to and complied with, and they need to be tested again and again and again. Freedom of information laws, for example. It's important to have them on the books, but one example in Kosovo, BIRN, the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network, spent 3 years trying to get access to the Prime Minister's office on these travel expense documents. And they have a good FOIA law in place. So when it takes 3 years to get access to this information, the law isn't working the way it's supposed to, and journalists often have to find a way around it. Another example is decriminalization of libel. Libel is decriminalized in almost every country, notably not in Hungary. And in Albania, actually, there was just a recent attempt to a very strong, robust attempt to recriminalize libel. It's good to have on the books, but when you have judges who regularly file a rule in favor of the plaintiff and impose punitive, heavy fines on the defendant, that can be just as chilling and have just as chilling of an effect on press freedom. And a third example is in transparency of ownership. Transparency laws, again, it's a good first step, but when you have a place like Moldova where there's severe concentration of ownership, or in Serbia where there's transparency and ownership for traditional media, but not for online media, or there's no transparency in advertising markets, like in Macedonia, it's just a partial victory. So that's where journalism support organizations, advocacy organizations, that's where they come in, because they hold politicians and officials' feet to the fire. They help ensure that these laws are complied with and adhered to. And so it's important to continue funding them so that they can test these laws over and over again. A second lesson learned is, excuse me, content is king. Just because the media sector is pluralistic doesn't mean that it's professional, and it doesn't mean that there's a diversity of views represented, or that it's not subject to soft censorship. An increasing number of people are getting their news, as Vjollca said, from digital media and from social media in particular. In the middle of this convergence of radio, TV, and print, you still need someone to curate the information and pull it together in a way that's relevant to local information needs. And that's where I think we can really improve our efforts in media literacy. And that includes not just working with educational systems, but also working with libraries, community centers, senior citizen programs, so that we're working with people of all ages from rural and urban backgrounds. And we're teaching them to learn how to discern fact from fiction in reporting. Where we're doing this well so far is in Ukraine, Georgia, and Armenia. And I think we can look at those models when hopefully we re-engage in Moldova. We can look at those models and apply them to places like Moldova. And working with audiences is just part of the equation. We also need to work with journalists themselves and teaching them attractive, compelling, and interesting for audiences. We also need to educate politicians at all levels on the importance of having a responsible press office and understanding that they don't have to work in an adversarial way with the press. They can work in a constructive way. And the third lesson, and I'll quote my predecessor here, the great Meg Gedosik, that transparency is the new objectivity. Donors need to recognize the importance of funding investigative journalism. Investigative journalism receives about 2%, that's according to Seema, Seema data, received about 2% of all media assistance funding. And it's probably the most important form of reporting when it comes to transparency and accountability, so that's quite low. Investigative journalism, it helps citizens better understand how crime and corruption affects their daily lives. It educates consumers on the misuse of public and private resources, and more importantly, on why they should care. It shines a light, it holds a mirror up to power, and it raises the level of public discourse away from personal attacks or partisan politics to the level of policy and institutional reforms. Donors can also do a better job of taking advantage of open data laws and governments' supposed commitment to open data. Public data released by open government partnership countries, of which most of these countries are actually members of the open government partnership. So public data on things like budget and procurement actions is often underreported, and it needs curation by journalists, trained journalists who understand how to scrape the data, how to pull the data together in a visually and compelling way. So it's also about training journalists in data visualization. And so this is exactly the type of partnership where investigative journalists and open data activists can work together. The fourth lesson is that progress is not always straightforward. political and economic changes can have a tremendous impact on the media environment. And I would actually argue most of the time this is the first place you see it. Press freedom is the canary in the coal mine. And so when you see constraints and restrictions in the media environment, you almost always see restrictions that follow in terms of liberty when things are improving. We need to have solid transitions in place, whether it's working with other donors to coordinate business, mentoring, coaching programs under something like the Media Development Investment Fund, or ensuring strong local supporting institutions, especially regional networks, and ensuring that they're in place to continue advocating for independent media. And when budgets are low and we simply can't compete directly with government-sponsored media, we need to find and cultivate alternative independent voices, whether it's investigative journalists, fact-checking bloggers, or open data activists. And we need to keep hitting home the message that strengthening independent media is a crucial element of democratic systems, and it's part of a very long-term effort. And this one is particularly difficult to learn. I think donors fail at this one time and time again. Media is often the last aspect of DG programming to be funded, and it's often the first to be cut. So it's kind of like the arts or PE in school. The bright spot, however, is that this is where centers like Seema can come in. You can see that I'm wearing my old Seema hat. By shining a light on how little is spent in democracy and governance on media. It gives us hard data to advocate for more funding, and more importantly, good analysis on how and where to fund it. And this leads to my final lesson, which is transitions from international to local implementers are working, but it takes a substantial amount of investment to prepare local organizations to manage large multi-year awards. And it has to be done right. Donors can develop transition grants, which is what USAID has done in Armenia, and it's what we're doing in Macedonia and Ukraine. It's still going to take a while. But we've had a consortium of local partners who are involved in advocacy, legal support, education, and training. And they work with an international implementer who helps serve as a resource to develop organizational capacity, accountability mechanisms, and collaboration systems. And the emphasis isn't just on local partners, but it's also on strengthening the support system itself. It can also build in accountability and sustainability from the start. And I was rereading a report by Ellen Hume, who is also on Seema's advisory council, and she teaches at Central European University. But she wrote a report called Media Missionaries in 2004. And it was a little bit frustrating to read. It's about the history of U.S. support to media assistance around the world, and there's a particular focus on the former Soviet Union. And it was a little frustrating because some of the lessons are still the same. Take a holistic approach, the importance of economic and political factors, and learning that we need to stay in for the long haul. But I realized, we're still making progress. The fact that we're talking about media literacy, that we're talking about open data laws, that we're talking about funding alternative independent voices is progress, and we're moving forward. And if you'll bear with me, I'll give one more quote from Yogi Berra. And this is actually one of his quotes on media development, if you didn't know, that media development is 90% lessons learned and the other half is funding. So if we stick to this, we'll be fine.
Thanks so much, Shannon. I went with Ellen Hume to Russia to train journalists before their first election, and we learned a lot. I've always wondered, I'd love to have gone back to see what those journalists did. So again, I want to talk somewhat systems and somewhat investing in people. But I want to have you take up, so you probably, although this is early morning, you might have seen the editorial in today's New York Times. I took the 5:50 flight out of RDU this morning, so I had lots of time to read. Poland deviates from democracy. So it's built on Mark talking about the legislation to really crack down on a number of things, including the media. So the question is just an insight, and I know you're here not talking for the State Department, and you have to be careful on that front. But obviously, national security issues, national just issues to the United States determines on sort of where funding goes and what's most important. So with the spotlight on Eastern Europe and Poland's activities in this sort of thing, what should we expect? What sort of the mood in there? Is the appetite heightened at this moment of the need to really, as Ellen said, go for the long haul, or, because it switches at times. Where's the appetite right now in the State Department?
Well, at USAID, and again, as we have the disclaimer, these are my own views and opinions. But this is something we talk about certainly on a weekly basis and sometimes on a daily basis. We understand the need to re-engage in some way. The question is how to do it. And when budgets are still a little bit uncertain, even in the next few years, the question is how to do it. But it's something that we're talking about. There is appetite. There is a recognition there, but it's making the case and making the argument to get the funding for it. And then spending that money wisely. And hopefully it's through these lessons learned where we can find a way to do that. I think we've learned, like I said, the importance of regional networks and associations and investigative journalism. Those are kind of the areas where you tend to get a lot of bang for your buck when you don't have a lot of funding. So, but it's something that we're talking about and we're definitely looking at.
And that helps because it's easier in ways to put money in a network of investigative journalists than to build a sector, for instance. And so, Leon, I wanted to go to that. One of the quotes from inside your index, because you do these focus groups that I found amazing, it talked about the business side, which you make a compelling case that's the one that is drooped and caused the sustainability index to go down. But they said, there's a collapse of advertising. We know about that in this country. Journalists certainly do. But the one I loved was, and management are unable to cope. Journalists, I'll be glad to say that as well. But it's coping with a completely changed information ecosystem. So where does IREX then? What does this sustainability say? How do you translate that then for people who are working with journalists who are really in the development field and those who are funding? What does it say?
Well, indeed, nobody, media development professionals, but who are very often come from the media and the media at large here in the United States and elsewhere didn't plan well for this. Newspapers going out of business and laying off longtime staff, and it was really, nobody could cope with it, and nobody was planning ahead. And looking back, I think that that was something that I think everybody could have done better. But I think that to answer your specific question, I think it's really creating a better understanding of the information ecosystem to fully take on that phrase in each of the countries, and helping the media that you're working with identify where they fit in that, and how they can use that, how they can capitalize on that, whether it's a business model or a nonprofit model or some kind of hybrid. It's important to really push the media institutions that we're working with to fully embrace becoming news and information organizations, not be a radio station or a newspaper anymore, but embrace multimedia and embrace multimedia online through mobile devices. Look at where the information ecosystem is and where it's going. If mobile's not particularly important in a country, it probably will be soon. And how do you plan for that? How do you get out ahead of that? How do you keep your audience?
And in fact, that is the U.S. experience. We've got to meet our audience where they are, not where we want to be. And I don't think that probably changes by borders. Vjollca, since you've been and you've seen this big sweep, and you have been on the front lines of training, et cetera, do you feel that the individual and the investments made in the individuals and the networks sort of trump the investments in institutions or organizations like media organizations? Is it one or the other?
Well, I see as I said, the individual journalists are there. What has changed drastically, and that may be the Trump factor, is that media ownership has changed. When you have individual journalists who want to do great reporting, get a phone call in the morning from their editor, the owner wants a story against Mark Nelson today. I want that story up in the afternoon. What do you do?
This happens so often.
This happens on a daily basis, and I know this from journalists that we've worked with. So, and if they don't do the story, they lose their job. They have kids to feed at home. The best that they can do is say, okay, I'm not qualified to do this story. I'll do another story. but somebody else picks up that story. So how do we deal with that? That is the main, challenge for many media organizations in the region. And I would say that when we look at media assistance, we should really focus on also helping media organizations become sustainable. And this doesn't happen overnight. We might need to look at providing financial assistance to begin with, and definitely go with all what you also said, Shannon and Susan, teaching and training on how to use how to make use of mobile, how to make use of the internet. A lot of the media organizations in the region have websites, but they're very hard to follow and read. They're like, copies of their print publications. That's an area there where could be a lot more training, and that people who are on the internet a lot in the region, they would like to see a website that is easier to follow. They could gravitate towards them simply because they're easier to read and bring the news. So there's this whole investment. It should, the individual journalist, yes, in support in training, but we need to invest more in how to help the media organizations survive. And that may begin with pure financial assistance. And I know this is not easy to do, because it's very hard to make the case, okay, we have this great organization, let's give them $1 million to get started. But is that, and I'm asking the question, is that something that we can consider doing? I don't know.
I mean, it's the reality, I think. But we want to do it in a way that's sustainable. I know we use that word a lot, but we have to explore that option as well as other options, like, as I mentioned, using funding through maybe the Media Development Investment Fund, which provides mentoring, coaching programs in business. So it's not just about providing financial assistance, which is important, but it's doing it in a way that's covering several sides of it. And coordinating with other donors too. I don't think it's necessarily choosing between either or, choosing certain areas to fund over the other because they're more successful, but it's the reality when we're working with limited budgets and we're making arguments that we shouldn't be making, that we said we developed this sector 10 years ago. It's hard to make the argument to go back in, and so we're not going to be getting a lot of money to do that. So it's about coordinating and funding these different areas that we see are important, and trying to cover all angles, but just in a way that's realistic.
And just one IREX question, and I'm going to turn it to the audience, so get your questions ready. Just in this index, does it show at all the internet business world, which is an information, business these days? I mean, Facebook is carrying more information than the New York Times, just about. It may be carrying some of the New York Times, but Facebook has become a news site. Are you seeing that in the sustainability index, that these information businesses are now really in news, doing the news?
It doesn't. We don't disaggregate by individual sectors within the media, but that is coming up. I mean, you do see the panelists talking a lot about aggregation sites that essentially take their content and make the money from it. Take the content that's been created by a media institution and just kind of post it. You see discussions, Contact or other type social media in the region being sort of the go-to source of news. Some of the money-making power away from the media.
All right, who wants to be the first question up? I think we have a microphone. It's going to come from here to the back there, right? Okay. So the woman with the red, she was up very quickly, so let's go to her. I mean, you got to...
Thank you. My name is Julia Velkovska. I work for Voice of America Macedonian Service. I would like to quickly ask the panelists regarding the media environment in Macedonia. In the latest report by Seema, it is mentioned that there is quote-unquote media capture by the state, diminishing the industry's professionalism and credibility. So probably from each short comment, that will be greatly appreciated.
Who would like to start with that? Macedonia. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that here, maybe I can quickly go back to the chart if this will work. Because here we go, and one more. Anyway, Macedonia to me stood out because because it actually the scores fell more dramatically, more quickly. If you look at the other three countries, it's more of a it takes longer for them to get down to the bottom. But Macedonia pretty precipitously dropped in 2009. And in addition to the economic issues and the business management issues, there was also a very strong political issue, which was namely Macedonia being blocked accession to NATO by the Greeks, as I understand it, and then the political change and the political division that then followed suit created a situation where the government pretty quickly took advantage and took control of the information space. Media was very quickly controlled or pushed out of business if they were not pro-government. There were other issues such as the way for example, cable, I believe it was the way cable systems were working, that local broadcasters lost out on the ability to access their local market because cable systems were shutting them out, cable systems that were controlled centrally, for example. So a lot of media lost their voice and lost their audience. And you couple that with political advertising money, which in Macedonia in particular was always on the weaker end in the business management side. I mean, its economy was behind that of some of the other countries on this chart, and it left the media in a weakened position. So I think that it was pretty quick, it was pretty severe, and it was very willful on the part of the government and politicians to really take over the information space.
We had a question over here, right there. Tell us your name and your question.
Hello, my name is Gillian McCormack. I'm with Internews. I don't know, did Yogi Berra say anything about sustainability of the media? Because I would like to make a pitch for less of an emphasis on business sustainability as a measure of the media's value and worth to the public. I mean, if you take the BBC and you remove from it sources of public funding and subsidy, it's not the BBC anymore. It would turn into something like Fox. And let's face it, we don't need two Foxes. And I think it's a bit of a problem for us, because while we understand, what Ellen Hume has been pointing out for more than 20 years now, that political interference and business interests overtly and negatively impact on media independence, we're still asked as media developers to get our media partners to focus a lot on their business diversification as a measure of their success. And that, of course, opens them up to the kind of negative influences that actually prevent them from being very independent. So, I think in those places where we've worked really long term, like Ukraine, we've had some positive. Broadcasting is now becoming something like a realistic possibility. You have small, very dynamic outfits like Hromadska that can get onto public, they can with very stuff that's useful for people. So measuring it according to whether it's maybe long-term business sustainable doesn't seem like a very fair indicator. What do you think?
Can I say something on this?
Yes, but get a microphone. And Internews is another very important player, I think, in this field, and has been for.
No, I think those are really important points, and for that very reason, Seema's just commissioned a report that's going to come out next month on looking at public service broadcasting and public service media in general more seriously, and we'll have an event on that topic with BBC Media Action and others, hopefully Internews as well, and talking about the questions that is raised by that, because there has been a de-emphasizing of that in donor assistance, particularly U.S. assistance. The Europeans have put more value in that, but even there, it has not been a sustained approach. And as you saw, that was the very first thing that the new Polish government attacked, was the public service broadcasters. It was the independent voice inside that, complex media environment there. So I think this issue is a really important one for us to look at. And one of the questions is to try to figure out what are the models for doing that work, because it is very hard for very weak countries with poor institutions to actually establish independent public service broadcasting, and there are not that many examples where it has worked. And that difficulty is one of the reasons I think that people turn back to the
conversation starting to turn away at USAID and among other donors, starting to turn away from using that as a strong indicator. We can't ignore it, but we do understand that that's business side. And what's happening in Ukraine is really interesting, I think. And maybe that's always in the back of our minds, and that's why we're a little bit hesitant. And I know it didn't work for a variety of reasons, but I think we really need to keep an eye on what's happening in Ukraine and possibly use that as a model, because it's very interesting. And part of it too is getting that public support, though, is getting the public to understand the importance of public interest reporting. And people are very supportive of that in Ukraine for now. And so if we can build that, maybe we can build on that in other countries and possibly use that as a model.
And sorry, just a quick, also, I mean, not to belabor the point about public broadcasting, but it's not limited only to countries like Poland and Hungary and elsewhere. I mean, even the Sarkozy government in France changed the structure of French public broadcasting so that the head of it was a political appointee. And I don't know if that's been changed back, but I mean, it's not just, these former East countries. But I will say, I mean, I think that in many ways, the media development community did succeed in doing just what you suggested, creating media that had a very strong public value. The problem is that others noticed this, and they used the financial angle as the Achilles heel to gain control of those media. B92 in Serbia, or other media that we had worked with that created, that were really valuable to the public, became taken over through money means by those who did not have the intent of serving the public good. And so the question there is then, how do we insulate the valuable information from that weak point?
I was going to give you a chance.
Yeah, just one thing also that I think affected the demise of public media in the region is also that all the good journalists that were working there, and there were many of them working in the public service media, they left because they were poorly paid, and they failed. They were under government control for all the reasons that we discussed. So that's why they are in such, weakened situation nowadays. And what would it take for these journalists to go back and work for public media? That is a tough question we need to consider when we think about it.
Go ahead.
Pena, IREX. So I have a sort of a question for the panelists. I'm wondering about your thoughts on how do you think about intervene as media development with media development work, and I'm thinking about these kinds of big question pictures like what Mark mentioned at the beginning. If there's within the EU a decline in press freedom, or questions that we talk about a lot in terms of the influence of Russian propaganda in the periphery. And so the MSI is looking at a region, but it's looking at individual countries. So how do we determine sort of contagion or influence from one country to the next, given limited resources, but given also that we know that there's a lot of influence cross borders and media traveling cross borders? How do we make these kinds of decisions?
And communities of journalists who are crossing across. Who wants to take that on? That's a critical question, the big strategic question.
I can start by, based on the experience of what ICFJ has done in the region and in other countries. I think, we're talking about globalization nowadays, and it's happening everywhere. It's the same. The same is true for Eastern Europe. We have, as you said, media and journalists crossing borders constantly. What can we do to bring these journalists together from different countries to work on specific projects? I'm going back again to OCCRP, a very good example and very successful example of doing that. They have centers, informal centers and journalists they work with across the region. And they are able to do this, again, I'm going back to this, because of international backing. They would not be able to do this on, they're not sustainable on their own. Is that a good model we can use for not just investigative journalism, but for other areas of journalism too? Can we bring the best of the best together and create a culture which is there? It's not, we talk about challenges, but there is awareness, the public, not just the journalists, but the public to realize that, hey, this media is powerful. They can make a change if they want to. And these voices are being raised. Can we create some organizations that are cross-border that can do, a News 24? Or I don't know, I'm just making this up. Would this be an area that the media community can look into and then help them through loans, through not just skills training, help them become sustainable down the road, create a paid model like Balkan Insight is doing that to a certain degree. It helps them. You have to pay to get full access to them, but that may be a good model that we can think about, a cross-border network that would produce quality news and people would learn how to get to, and it would have to be in multiple languages, of course.
Yeah, I agree with Vjollca. I mean, again, it's not an either or question, but this is an area where you can get a lot of return on your investment. Is like with OCCRP, you're working with these networks and these partnerships. Maybe not just with investigative journalists. That's a wonderful model, but I think that's something we can apply to other areas of journalism. And again, maybe these partnerships with open data activists, building these partnerships so that we're continuing to provide the high quality of journalism that we spent so much time investing in. And then also, again, getting the other side of the equation, getting the public to
Sure. I think, also I think if we plan for success, we also need to recognize that, again, I mean, what I was saying earlier, that the success creates something that is therefore valuable to those who want to use it for their own purposes. And I think, even if we say, okay, well, we're going to get away from a more full-time technical assistance kind of approach in a certain country, leaving behind a legacy of something flexible and quick that can work in a region, can focus on a region, and maybe include support for investigative journalism, for example. When something comes up in a country, I mean, being able to quickly get in there and provide support, some limited focused technical assistance as well. I think that's something else. I mean, I think maybe the next step beyond, what we were doing, these very focused and these longer term technical assistance type projects.
In the back of the room, he's got my eye before, so if we get it, and then we'll come on up. And so we'll try to get as many questions as we can.
Thank you. It's a very useful discussion. Chris Walker at NED. It strikes me that the landscape has changed so dramatically. Leon and others have noted this, and the IREX data points it out, that many of the forces that were at work in the young democracies under discussion were accelerated with the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, so that newspapers in the Visegrad countries that used to have at least a number of foreign correspondents now have interns that transcribe English language material into Czech or Slovak, and that constitutes their foreign coverage. It constitutes their coverage of Brussels as well. And these are, new EU countries that have this very thin and often superficial coverage of Brussels, which you can well imagine is not a healthy thing. I would argue that the trajectory that's taken hold in recent years, and which it shows really no sign of changing, is a direct threat to the democratic success of these countries. Whether you talk about Latvia, the Czech Republic, Hungary's already on its way, the Balkans can go either way in the coming years. And I'm wondering, two questions to the panel. One is, what key adjustments or innovations have been identified given the kind of rolling problems that have emerged over the last decade, you could say at least? And what would it take to reframe this discussion, not as one of whether certain media institutions or public broadcasters might do a little better or survive in the near term, into one that argues that the ongoing degradation of democratic media in the region is actually a threat to the success of these countries, their ability to cover corruption, their ability to cover politics, Brussels. It seems to me there needs to be more urgency in this discussion.
Well, Seema is the one who carries this flag, as I see it, in ways, because even the enthusiastic talk about democracy is lessened. So you guys take that. How do you answer that question?
Well, I think, when you look at what will it take to reframe this discussion, I think it is an effort that the wider media development community is undertaking, which is to say, how can we show that media matters and media success also equals the success, political development success, really. But I think, more specifically, I think it's, showing how, highlighting the work of investigative reporters. I think that some of the examples used earlier, I think that might be one of the key ways. Adjustments and innovations, I go back to the comment I made about looking ahead and how information sectors are changing and keeping a pace with that. And I think investing in understanding those sectors, that ecosystem, is vital. And I think it's something that Internews has done a lot of work on, and as a community, media development has always looked at the importance of what the audience is doing, where they're getting their information, and it's taking that to the next level with social media on top and new types of communications tools. And I think that piling that on top, I think that's the innovation. I think that's where we need to continue to focus from sort of the contextual side.
Well, I think part of reframing the debate, I feel like that's a huge part of my job. I feel like I spend so much time talking to colleagues at the State Department and within USAID on the importance of media development as part of democracy and governance programming. The good news is, I think for FY18, fiscal year 18, as part of the F process, we're actually moving media development, which has been a subsector under civil society, to its own element in the F process, which is huge. I know maybe it sounds really small, like a small achievement. You can actually see much more clearly how much we're spending to the other sectors of political processes, governance, anti-corruption. And so that I think will help us reframe and reshape the debate. And also part of my job too is trying to get the conversation away from countering propaganda. It's not about going head to head and toe to toe with governments like Russia. It's about funding independent media, local voices, these alternative information platforms, if we have to, citizen bloggers. And a few years ago, we always said, would you want a citizen dentist serving you? Why would you want a citizen journalist or a citizen blogger? But things have changed. And USAID actually works quite a bit with citizen bloggers. And so that's a small part of it, but reframing the debate away from countering mainly countering Russian propaganda, but away from that and getting other actors in the U.S. government to understand that I think this is a key part of it. Public diplomacy is a part of it. Public broadcasting, organizations like VOA, BBG are part of it. But at the heart of it should be funding local independent media.
Yeah, just very briefly, I agree that it's very important to reframe the debate with what is happening, not just in Eastern Europe, but across Europe, even in Western Europe or in the EU. And while, this is a regression of democratic values, there's no other word for it. It's simple as that. And it's really sad to see in a region which made such a huge leap forward 10 years ago. I do agree with the adjustment to innovation, and the way I see it from a media development organization as ICFJ and others here is that what we can do in the region is what we're doing already very successful in other parts of the world, in Latin America, in Africa. We're working with groups of journalists, with associations of journalists too, and independent media to help them, use technologies, mobile applications, to not only get information, increase access to quality information, but also to help them build sustainability, because people get to them, they have a larger audience that lets them get more advertising, which is, we talked about that being problematic, but it has proven successful in countries such as Kenya, Chile, Peru, across Latin America. We've built networks again of journalists that are coming up with digital ways to get information across borders. And that's an area that I don't want to go into detail now, but that we could be looking more into Eastern Europe, and these are not as developed there as in other parts of the world.
We're going to go right here with the red tie, and then we'll go to you next. Okay.
Hi, I'm Charles Self. I'm the former dean of the Journalism College at the University of Oklahoma, and also former president of the National Journalism Educators Group. In recent years, there's been a lot of growth. Programs might provide a way of increasing the sustainability and lessening the regression, particularly in giving support to journalists who are doing good work in Eastern Europe.
There's no jobs, or they go
America and kind of do your own thing, but they have to find their own funding. It's very inexpensive for them to be on our campus. Putting somebody through a master's program or something like that does take, an investment that can sometimes happen. But I think our students in this globalized world really benefit. We had a young man who just finished his master's program, went back to Belarus, and I'm like trying to find out how he's doing, because that's not an area. I think it is an important area for American democracy and just for American know-how, that there is more of that give and take. But it costs more to put someone through an American school for matriculating than it does to get a training program there. And those are the realities for it. Right in front here, I promised this next one, and then I'm going to go back there. And how long can we go? We got 2 more minutes. Okay. Yeah. Tell us your name.
Thank you. Murat Raimkanov. I'm a media expert and a Hubert Humphrey Fellow from Kazakhstan. Several countries, including Russia, Azerbaijan, and recently Kazakhstan, introduced new NGO legislation that actually intends to block, or at least to control, the foreign funding of the local civil societies. So how do you think should the organizations like IREX, USAID, and others address this issue, and what are other alternative ways of helping media organizations in particular in those countries? Thank you.
Okay. Right in the pink jacket back there. Tell us your name.
Hi, Joan Maurer. Comment is that distribution and reaching young people seem to me to be the objectives of media moving forward. But for the panel, how would you engage the U.S. government in an election year to focus more attention on this issue, because it is really lost? U.S. government, no one really cares about media development anymore, as far as I can see. And even places like Azerbaijan, where our reporter's been imprisoned for a long time, it's not even mentioned. So I'd like to just get one sentence from each of you. How do we get this on the front burner again?
It's nice to see that editorial, at least in the New York Times today. Right over here, right back here, and then we'll get the panel to answer.
I'm Adrian Karmazin with US-Ukraine Foundation. Some of the panelists had mentioned the idea of media, making people better consumers of media. How much can we educate college students on being better consumers of media?
It's a media literacy piece. Okay, you each get 2 sentences. And I'm being really permissive.
Okay, I'll start with the first question of the laws against barring foreign assistance to these countries. From the perspective of my organization, I would suggest that we'd find ways to work with individual journalists, bring them out of the country, going back to that cross-border network so that we continue the work that we've started. To Joan's question, how do we get in front of the US government in an election year? I would go to the government and say, why don't you do a program to bring journalists from this area to see how we do the elections in this country and go and report?
I just had them for our election. I just had them at least go to the voting.
It would be a way to, it's eye-opening, and they see what the problems are in this country, and they get some training in the meantime, and create more opportunities for this to continue after the election. Very short answer to that. Media literacy in schools, I don't think it's just a school question, frankly, because it's easier to introduce it in journalism schools. It should be across the board. It could start in elementary school or middle school. Train kids that, teach kids this is how you get the news and this is what the news means.
Question. Sorry, are you talking about American schools or getting involved in media literacy campaigns and efforts and community centers, and also, bridging the divide, maybe having younger students work with their grandparents and educating them on how to use the computer and how to use it to get information and to get good information, to pay attention to the sources of information that they're looking at, because that educates both sides. And particularly in rural areas too, if you can get those programs going. Getting information about our indicators and showing the real results from our work, especially when it comes to investigative journalism. So I think being able to show those results and link them to these really defined results like asset forfeiture and asset freezers, officials on the travel ban. Those are real results that we're getting. So if we can show that our media programs are doing that, then larger case for places like Azerbaijan.
And actually, to build on that about putting media development on the front burner, I think in addition to the positive examples, looking at what is the cause of some of the negative examples, which, you can say, why is propaganda sticking? Propaganda is sticking because the media sectors as a whole are weak. If you had a strong, fully credible media in Ukraine for many years, you wouldn't have, Russian, wouldn't have so much traction.
I'm going to get the final word here.
I'm an optimist. I wouldn't still be doing this kind of work. Being at a university every day with young people helps you to be an optimist. I know a lot of people don't think that. I have to say that we are a school of journalism, or always was, but 54% are studying PR and advertising because their parents are telling to do that. But the people who still pick journalism have passion, and democracy is what it's all about, and giving voice to people. And so I am optimistic because I find this generation, from wherever they are hungry for information, and they're finding it. And the revolution was always when you're going to have the revolution, you always went to the TV station, the central spot anyway. So if we can cultivate the hunger for information and do it, I think that there'd be lots of ups and downs, and I think there would be more downs for a while because we have a revolution going on. We don't know we don't know where the media is going. But I am optimistic because I just think that human passion, and journalists are born, not just trained, they will not stop until they can really inform. But we must be networks, we must be partnerships, and we must be vigilant. So thank you, Seema, for being here, and for Ned, because the reason we think are passionate about media is because it does give people democratic opportunity. And I, for one, believe journalism is in the front lines of that. So thank you for this. Thank you for being a terrific audience, and this is a great panel. See you later.